Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff, and welcome to Chapter 18, The Introduction to Darwinian Evolution. In the beginning of our study of evolution, we defined evolution as the accumulation of genetic changes within populations over time. And along with that definition, you should also go back and say, but what is a population? So a population is defined as a group of individuals of one species that live in the same geographic area at the same time. So just as the definition of gene changed as you studied genetics, you will find the definition of evolution will be more precise in later chapters. So as I get now here to the term called evolution, it does not refer to changes that occur within an individual within its lifetime. I'll put it bluntly. Individuals do not evolve. It is populations that evolve. So it instead refers to those changes in the characteristics of populations over the course of generations. These changes may be so small that they are difficult to detect, or so great that the population differs markedly from its ancestral population. So eventually, two populations may diverge to such a degree that we refer to them as different species. And this concept will be brought up extensively in the next two chapters, being in chapter 20 particularly. So for now, a simple working definition of a species is that a species is a group of organisms with similar genetic information, structure, function, and behavior that are capable of interbreeding with one another. So evolution has two main perspectives. There's minor evolution, also referred to as microevolution, and that minor evolution occurring in the population. So those minor evolutionary changes in populations. And that's usually viewed over a few generations. So then there are those major evolutionary events referred to as macroevolution, such as information from different species from common ancestors that are usually viewed over a long period. So evolution has many, and I say again, evolution has many practical applications. For instance, in agriculture, you must deal with the evolution of pesticide resistant in insects and other pests, which is why integrated pest management is used. Likewise, in medicine, medicine must respond to the rapid evolutionary potential of disease-causing organisms, such as bacteria or viruses. Hence, there is that seasonal flu vaccine that is new every single season. So, the medical researchers use evolutionary principles to predict which flu strains are evolving more quickly than others, and the information that scientists need to make that next year's flu vaccine, as I mentioned. Also, researchers developing effective treatment strategies for the human immunodeficiency virus, known as HIV, must understand its evolution both within and among hosts. So, given those things, let's now get into the next part. So, next up, we'll get to section 18.3, Darwin and evolution. I left this here from the prior section because it mentions Lamarck and Lamarckian evolution. So, by way of Lamarckian evolution, he suggests that organisms pass on traits that they acquire during their lifetime to their offspring, which, by way of Lamarckian evolution, that was not correct, meaning it can also be referred to as the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and that is not what's passed down. What is passed down will be those things that are heritable features, those things that provide that, I guess you should say, selection for, rather than things that were selected against, not things that were acquired throughout life. So Darwin was the son of a physician, and he was sent to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh. And he found himself unsuited for medicine, so he transferred to Cambridge University to study theology. So he became the protege of Henslow, a reverend, who was a professor of botany, and Henslow encouraged Darwin's interests in the natural world. So shortly after receiving his degree, Darwin embarked on the HMS Beagle, which was taking a 5-year exploratory cruise around the world to prepare navigation charts for the British Navy. So the HMS Beagle left England in 1831 and cruised along the east and west coast of South America. While members of the crew mapped the coasts and harbors, Darwin spent many weeks ashore studying the animals, plants, fossils, and geologic formations on both coasts and inland regions, areas that had been extensively explored. He collected and cataloged thousands of plant and animal specimens and kept notes of his observations and information that became essential in the development of his ideas. So, as he was on the Beagle, they spent almost 2 months at the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin continued his observations and collections. He compared the animals and plants of the Galapagos Islands to those of the South American mainland, and he was particularly impressed by their similarities and wondered why organisms of the Galapagos should resemble those from South America more than those from other islands in different parts of the world. Although there were similarities between the Galapagos and South American species, there are also distinct differences. There are even recognizable differences in the reptiles and birds from one island to the next, and he wondered why those remote islands should have such biological diversity. So after he returned home, Darwin pondered these observations and attempted to develop a satisfactory explanation for the distribution of species among islands. He drew on several lines of evidence when considering how species might have arisen. Despite the work of Lamarck, the general notion in the mid-1800s was that Earth was too young for organisms to have changed significantly since they had first appeared during the 19th century. However, geologists advanced the idea that mountains, valleys, and other physical features of their surface did not originate in their present forms. Instead, those features developed slowly over long periods of time. So, speaking of this, other than Lamarck, who put forth the inheritance of acquired characteristics, there was another one, Charles Lyell. So Charles Lyell penned the Principles of Geology, and he said that Earth is very old, and the things that shaped the past are still shaping the Earth today. So please do keep that in mind. So other important evidence that influenced Darwin was that breeders and farmers could develop many varieties of domesticated animals in just a few generations. They did so by choosing certain traits and breeding only individuals that exhibited the desired traits, which is known as artificial selection. So again, this is when we, people on Earth, man, woman, him, it, they, selectively breed in plants and animals, such as the brassicas, as you see right here. So breeders have produced numerous varieties of dogs, bloodhounds, golden retrievers, labradoodles, Great Danes, all of which by means of artificial selection. And many plant varieties were also produced by artificial selection, and as you see right there, the cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, collard greens, kale, and even kohlrabi are distinct vegetable crops that are all members of the same species. So selective breeding of colewort, or wild cabbage, a leafy plant native to Europe and Asia, produced all 7 vegetables. So it began over 4,000 years ago, and some farmers were artificially selected wild cabbage plants that formed overlapping leaves, and over time, the leaves became so prominent in the plants, which resembled modern cabbages. So next up, I'll get to the ideas of Thomas Malthus. So he had penned the Principles of Populations. So what was stated that over time there would be a struggle for existence, and it's all due to the growth in population. For instance, as the population increases and increases and increases, it will increase so much so that the supply for food would not be able to meet the demand. So Malthus also suggested that the conflict between population growth and food supplies, it generates famine, disease, and even war. So his idea is that a strong and constant check on human population growth strongly influenced Darwin's explanation of evolution, and the result of which would be adaptation. It's an evolutionary modification that improves the chances of survival and reproductive success in a given area. Eventually, the accumulation of modifications might result in a new species, and time was the only thing required for a new species to originate. And the geologists of the era, including Lyell, had supplied evidence that Earth was indeed old enough to provide adequate time. So Darwin had at last developed a workable scientific explanation of evolution, that of natural selection, in which better adapted organisms are more likely to survive and become the parents of the next generation. And this is as a result of natural selection. So the population changes over time, and the frequency of favorable traits increases in successive generations, whereas less favorable traits become scarcer, and they may even disappear. So Darwin spent the next 20 years formulating his arguments for natural selection, accumulating an immense body of evidence to support this explanatory mechanism and corresponding with other scientists. So just keep in mind, it is natural selection, which is always positive, that sorts out those winners and losers. And natural selection is the driver of evolution. And along that same note, natural selection is not random at all. It repeats itself. So along with it, it's going to be adaptation by means of natural selection. And the way in which it happens is all by way of mutation. So mutation is that random component, and it could be either positive or negative. So mutations, which are those rare events which occur, is that driver of evolution by means of natural selection. So next up, we'll get down to how Darwin proposed that evolution occurs by natural selection. So variation. The individuals in a population exhibit variation, and each individual has a unique combination of traits such as size, color, ability to tolerate harsh environment conditions, and resistance to certain parasites or infections. Some traits improve an individual's chance to survive or its reproductive success, whereas others do not. So please keep in mind that variation is necessary for evolution by means of natural selection, and it must be inherited. So, although Darwin recognized the importance to evolution of inherited variation, he did not know the mechanism of inheritance. Overproduction. The reproducibility, the reproductive ability, of a species has the potential to cause its population to geometrically increase over time. A female frog lays about 10,000 eggs, and a female cod perhaps 40 million eggs. In each case, however, only about 2 offspring survive to reproduce. Thus, in every generation, each species has the capacity to produce more offspring that can survive. Limits on population growth or a struggle for existence. There's only so much food, water, light, growing space, and other resources available to a population. So organisms compete with one another for these limited resources because there are more individuals than the environment can support. Not all survive to reproduce. Other limits on population growth include predators, disease, organisms, and unfavorable weather conditions. Differential reproductive success. Those individuals that have the most favorable combination of characteristics, those that make individuals better adapted to their environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce. Offspring tend to resemble their parents because the next generation inherits the parents' genetically based traits. Successful reproduction is the key to natural selection. The best adapted individuals produce the most offspring, whereas individuals that are less well adapted die prematurely, or produce fewer or inferior offspring. So over time, enough changes may accumulate in geographically separated populations to produce a new species. Excuse me. Darwin noted that in the Galapagos Islands, finches appear to evolve in this way. The 14 species are closely related, all descended from a common ancestor, a single species that found its way from South America mainland 2 million to 3 billion years ago. So during this time period, the number of islands increased, the climate changed, the plant life and food supply changed. The different islands of the Galapagos kept the finches isolated from one another, thereby allowing them to diverge into separate species in response to varying conditions. So now we'll move on from finches and the variation, particularly in their beaks, based on their diet, to the modern synthesis. One premise that Darwin based his scientific theory of evolution by natural selection is that individuals transmit traits to the next generation. However, Darwin was unable to explain how this occurs or why individuals vary within population. You learned earlier that Mendel elucidated the basic patterns of inheritance. Darwin, who was a contemporary of Mendel, was apparently not acquainted with Mendel's work. Indeed, the scientific community did not recognize Mendel's work until the early part of the 20th century. So beginning in the 1930s and 40s, biologists experienced a conceptual breakthrough when they combined the principles of Mendelian inheritance with Darwin's principle of natural selection. The result was a unified explanation of evolution, known as the modern synthesis. So this conceptual breakthrough happened, and it combined these two together. In this context, the synthesis refers to combining parts of several scientific theories to form a unified whole. Some of the founders of the modern synthesis was Dubyansky, Fisher, Haldane, Huxley, Mayer, Gaylord Simpson, and that's the middle and last name, Stebbins, and Wright. So today, the modern synthesis incorporates our expanding knowledge of genetics, systematics, paleontology, developmental biology, behavior, and ecology. So the modern synthesis explains Darwin's observation of variation among offspring in terms of mutation or changes in DNA, such as nucleotide substitutions. Mutations provide the genetic variability on which natural selection acts during evolution. The modern synthesis, which emphasizes the genetics of populations as a central focus of evolution, has held up well since it was developed. It has dominated the thinking and the research of biologists working in many areas and has resulted in an enormous accumulation of new discoveries that validate the evolution by natural selection. Most biologists not only accept the basic principles of the modern synthesis, but also try to better understand the causal processes of evolution. So, let's get to the effect of chance on evolution. Biologists have wondered whether we would get the same results if we were to repeat evolution by starting with similar organisms in a similar environment. And I've already mentioned that it does repeat. It is repeatable. So in this picture you're seeing female fruit flies in southern countries have smaller wings than in northern counties. So again, in Europe, female fruit flies in southern counties have smaller wings than flies in northern counties. So the one on the left is from Spain, and the other on the right is from Denmark. So the same evolutionary pattern emerged in North America after the accidental introduction of the fruit fly to the Americas. Now to evidence for evolution. Perhaps the most direct evidence for evolution comes from the discovery, identification, and the interpretation of fossils, which are the remains or traces typically left in sedimentary rock by previously existing organisms. Sedimentary rock forms by the accumulation of solidification of particles, produced by the weathering of older rocks, such as volcanic rocks. The sediment particles, which are usually deposited on a riverbed, a lake bottom, or even the ocean floor, accumulate over time and exhibit distinct layers. In an undisturbed rock sequence, the oldest layer is at the bottom, and the upper layers are successively younger. The study of sedimentary rock layers include their composition, the arrangement, and similarity from one location to another, and it enables geologists to place events recorded in rocks in the correct sequence. All right. So given the sedimentary rock, we'll now move on to what is to come next. So by way of the fossil record, the more recent remains have been well preserved in bogs or in tar or the ancient tree resin called amber, or even in ice. For example, the remains of a woolly mammoth frozen in Siberian ice for more than 25,000 years were so well preserved that part of its DNA could be analyzed. So now that we've gotten through fossils and the way in which sedimentary rock is formed, we'll now get to not determining age, but radioactive isotopes. So radioactive isotopes they emit nuclear particles and change into a different element. Each radioactive isotope has a characteristic rate of decay, and that's the time required for 1/2 of a radioactive isotope's atoms to change into a different atom is its half-life. For instance, uranium-235 decays into lead-207 with a half-life of 704 million years. So giving this the age of fossils can be determined. So I won't go through the part on carbon-14 at this very moment. I'm getting now to biogeography. So the study of the past and present geographic distribution of organisms is called biogeography. The geographic distribution of organisms affect their evolution. Darwin was interested in biogeography, and he considered why species found on ocean islands tend to resemble species of the nearest mainland, even if the environment is different. He also observed that species on islands do not tend to resemble species on ocean islands do not tend to resemble species on islands with similar environments in other parts of the world. Darwin studied the plants and animals on 2 sets of arid islands, the Cape Verde Islands, nearly 400 miles off of the coast of western Africa, and the Galapagos Islands, about 600 miles west of Ecuador, South America. On each group of islands, the plants and terrestrial animals were indigenous. They were native. But those of the Cape Verde Islands resembled African species, and those of the Galapagos Islands resembled South American species. The similarities of the Galapagos species to South American species were particularly striking, considering that the Galapagos Islands are dry and rocky, and the nearest part of South America is humid and has a lush tropical rainforest. Darwin concluded that species from the neighboring continent migrated or were carried to the islands, where they subsequently adapted to the new environment, and in the process evolved into new species. If evolution were not a factor in the distribution of species, we would expect to find a given species everywhere it could survive. However, the actual geographic distribution of organisms makes sense in the context of evolution. For example, Australia, which has been a separate landmass for millions of years, has distinctive organisms. Australia has populations of egg-laying mammals, the monotremes, and pouched mammals, the marsupials, not found anywhere else. 200 million years ago, Australia and the other continents were joined in a major landmass. Over the course of millions of years, the Australian continent gradually separated from the others. The monotremes and marsupials in Australia continued to thrive and diversify. The isolation of Australia also prevented placental mammals, which arose elsewhere at a later time, from competing with its monotremes and marsupials. And in other areas of the world where placental mammals evolved, most monotremes and marsupials became extinct. So briefly, I'll get to Wegener and Earth's geologic history. So Wegener, who noted a correspondence between the geographic shapes of South America and Africa, proposed that all the land masses had at one time been joined into one huge supercontinent which he called Pangaea. He further suggested that Pangaea had subsequently broken apart and that various land masses had separated in a process known as continental drift. So Wegener did not know of any mechanism that could have caused continental drift, so his idea, although debated initially, was largely ignored. In the 1960s, scientific evidence provided the explanation for continental drift. The Earth's crust is composed of 7 large plates that float on the mantle, which is a mostly solid layer of Earth lying beneath the crust and above the core. The land masses are situated on some of these plates. As the plates move, the continents change their relative positions. Hence I show this. So the movement of the crustal plates is called plate tectonics. Anywhere where 2 plates meet is a site of intense geologic activity. Earthquakes and volcanoes are common in such a region. Both San Francisco, noted for its earthquakes, and Mount St. Helens volcano are situated where 2 plates meet. If land masses lie on the edges of 2 adjacent plates, mountains may form. The Himalayas form when the plate carrying India rammed into the plate carrying Africa. The Himalayas formed, and I mistakenly said Africa, but the Himalayas formed when the plate carrying India rammed into the plate carrying Asia. So when 2 plates grind together, one of them is sometimes buried under the other in a process called subduction. When 2 plates move apart, a ridge of lava forms between them. The Atlantic Ocean is increasing in size because of the expanding zone of lava along the mid-Atlantic ridge where the 2 plates are separating. And now to the comparative anatomy of related species. So comparing the structural details of features found in different but related animals reveals basic similarity. So such features that are derived from the same structure and a common ancestor are called homologous features, or homologous structures. In other words, the features derived from the same structure and a common ancestor, such as vertebrate forelimbs. So this condition is known as homology. So as I mentioned a second ago, consider the limb bones of mammals. A human arm, a cat forelimb, a whale front flipper, and a bat wing, although quite different in appearance, have strikingly similar arrangements of bones, muscles, and nerves. So you can see the comparison of the skeletal structures here. Each has a single bone, the humerus, in the part of the limb nearest the trunk of the body, followed by 2 bones, the radius and ulna, of the forearm. So a group of bones called carpals in the wrist, and a variable number of digits, or metacarpals and phalanges. This similarity is particularly striking because arms or forelimbs, flippers, and wings are used for different types of locomotion, and there is no overriding mechanical reason for them to be so similar structurally. Similar arrangements of parts of the forelimb are evident in ancestral birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and even the first fishes that came out of the water onto land hundreds of millions of years ago. Leaves provide homology in plants. In many species, leaves have been modified for functions other than photosynthesis. A cactus spine and a pea tendril, although quite different in appearance, are homologous because both are modified leaves. The spine protects the succulent stem tissue of the cactus, whereas a tendril, which winds around a small object once it makes contact, helps support the climbing stem of the pea plant. Such modifications in organs, used in different ways, are the expected outcome of a very common evolutionary origin. The basic structure present in a common ancestor was modified in different ways for different functions as various descendants subsequently evolved. So not all species with similar features have descended from a recent common ancestor, however. Sometimes similar environmental conditions result in evolution of similar adaptations. Such independent evolution of similar structures in distant organisms is known as convergent evolution. So aardvarks, anteaters, and pangolins are excellent examples of convergent evolution. They resemble one another in lifestyle and certain structural features. All have strong, sharp claws to dig open ant and termite mounds, and elongated snouts with long, sticky tongues to catch those insects. Yet aardvarks, anteaters, and pangolins evolved from three distantly related groups of mammals. So structurally similar features that are not homologous but have similar function that are evolved independently in distantly related organisms are said to be homoplastic features, or homoplasy. So such similarities in different species are independently acquired by convergent evolution and not by common descent. And that is homoplasy. And another way to term homoplasy could be an analogous structure. An analogous structure. So, for example, the wings of various distantly related flying animals, such as insects and birds, they resemble one another superficially. They are homoplastic features that evolved over time to meet a common function of flight, although they differ in more fundamental aspects. Bird wings are modified forelimbs supported by bones, whereas insects' wings may have evolved from gill-like appendages present in aquatic ancestors of insects. And then on to vestigial structures. So those vestigial structures are the organs or parts of organs that are seemingly non-functional and degenerate. For instance, I'll say yet again, the comparative anatomy reveals these vestigial structures, and many organisms contain organs or parts of organs that seem to be the case. So vestigial structures are remnants of more developed structures that were present and functional in ancestral organisms. In the human body, more than 100 structures are considered vestigial, including the coccyx, our fused tailbones, third molars, you know those things, your wisdom teeth, and the muscles that move our ears. There you have it. There you have it. So next up, I'll get to the genetic code, and our genetic code is virtually universal. Organisms owe their characteristics to the types of proteins they possess, which in turn are determined by the sequence of nucleotides in their mRNA, or their messenger ribonucleic acid, as specified by the order of nucleotides in their DNA. So evidence that all life is related comes from all organisms using a genetic code that is virtually identical. So the universality of the genetic code, no other code has been found in any organism, is convincing evidence that all organisms arose from a common ancestor. So the genetic code has been maintained and transmitted through all branches of the evolutionary tree since its origin, in some extremely early and successful organism. So there you have it. So having gotten this far, this shows differences in DNA nucleotide sequences as evidence for evolutionary relationships. I showed this here because it's comparing the same gene in different organisms, and it provides a window into the evolution. So here the differences in the non-protein coding region of the beta globin gene are compared between humans and other primates. So evolutionary biologists are rapidly expanding such studies from comparing one or several genes to comparing entire genomes. So it just shows you now the percent divergence in non-coding protein sequence in that beta globin gene. So you can see just how closely we are related to the tarsier. You can see how closely related we are to the orangutan, and how closely related we are to that chimpanzee, and even that gorilla. So in your test, I'll ask the question about how closely related we are based on what you're seeing right here. And now to cladograms. So we'll have cladograms come up again in subsequent chapters. But to introduce them, this branching diagram is called a cladogram, and I'll show you a cladogram here. So it shows the proposed evolutionary relationships based on available data. So the organisms depicted here, they share a common ancestor. So the DNA sequence differences among these simply mammals suggest that hooved mammals, such as hippos and giraffes, are the closest living relatives to whales. So the hippopotamus is probably the closest living relative to the whale, and the nodes or circles, they represent branch points where the species splits into two or more lineages. And it says ruminants are mammals such as cows, sheep, and giraffes that have a multi-chamber stomach and chew regurgitated plant material to make it more digestible. So this has been chapter 18. I hope that you've learned things well on this introduction to evolution. And please be sure to see the summary focus as it's shown there at the end of the chapter. This has been your instructor, Skylar Huff. Thank you all for listening, and please study well.